Step into the unknown with Serenity Valley Stories. Remember to like and subscribe, if you wish to hear more. And now our feature presentation, The Night of the Heartstealer. The old house creaked and groaned as the wind swept through the surrounding trees, making the entire structure feel like a living, breathing thing. I had inherited the house from my grandmother, an ancient building that had been in our family for generations. It was nestled in the heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains, a place where time seemed to stand still, and the old ways still held power. I had come to this place seeking solace, hoping that the quiet and isolation would help me recover from the recent loss of my mother. Her death had been sudden and brutal, a heart attack that had taken her in the dead of night. Now, alone in the house that had once belonged to her and her ancestors, I found myself surrounded by memories that were both comforting and suffocating. The locals were kind enough, but there was a distance between us, an unspoken understanding that I was an outsider, despite my family's long history in the area. They spoke in hushed tones about the old legends, the stories passed down through the generations about spirits and creatures that lurked in the shadows of the mountains. Most of all, they spoke of the Ravenmocker, the most feared of all the spirits, a creature that stole the lives of the sick and the elderly to prolong its own existence. At first, I dismissed these stories as superstitions, the kind of tales meant to scare children and keep them from wandering too far into the woods. But as the days turned into weeks, and the nights grew longer and darker, I began to feel a presence in the house, something cold and malevolent that seemed to watch me from the shadows. It started with the whispers. At first, they were faint, barely audible, like the wind rustling through the leaves. But as time went on, they grew louder, more insistent, until I could hear them clearly, even in the dead of night. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable, threatening, filled with malice. I tried to ignore them, telling myself it was just my imagination, the result of too many sleepless nights and too much time spent alone. But then came the dreams, vivid and terrifying visions that left me drenched in sweat and gasping for breath. In these dreams, I was pursued by a dark figure, a shape that shifted and changed, sometimes taking the form of a bird, other times a man with piercing, red eyes. The figure would chase me through the woods, its breath hot on the back of my neck, its claws scraping against my skin. No matter how fast I ran or how hard I tried to hide, it always found me, cornering me in some dark, forgotten place before lunging at me with a scream that echoed in my ears long after I woke. The worst part was the feeling of dread that hung over me like a shroud, a suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. I knew, deep down, that something was coming for me, something ancient and evil, something that wouldn't stop until it had taken everything from me. I started to notice other things, too, small, almost imperceptible changes in the house. The temperature would drop suddenly, the air growing cold and thick, even though the fire was roaring in the hearth. Objects would move on their own, doors would creak open and shut without any wind, and I could hear footsteps in the hallways at night, even though I was alone. I became obsessed with the legends, spending hours poring over old books and speaking with the few locals who would still talk to me. The more I learned about the Ravenmocker, the more terrified I became. It was said to be able to become invisible, to mimic voices, and to manipulate its surroundings to drive its victims mad with fear. It was a creature of darkness, a being that fed on the pain and suffering of others. And now, it was coming for me. One night, as I sat in the dimly lit living room, staring into the flickering flames of the fireplace, I heard it again, the whispering. This time, it was louder, more urgent, as if it was right next to me. I turned, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing, just the empty room and the shadows that danced along the walls. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I turned back to the fireplace, and there, in the flames, I saw a face, a twisted, hideous face with eyes that glowed like embers. It grinned at me, its mouth filled with sharp, jagged teeth, and I could hear the whispering growing louder, filling my head with words I couldn't understand. I stumbled back, tripping over the edge of the rug and falling to the floor. The room seemed to spin around me, the walls closing in as the whispering turned into a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, all saying the same thing, your heart, your heart. I tried to stand, but my legs felt like they were made of lead, my body refusing to obey my commands. The face in the flames grew larger, more defined, and I could see it clearly now, a raven, its feathers black as night, its eyes burning with an unholy light. And then, with a sudden burst of speed, it shot out of the fireplace, flying straight at me. I screamed, throwing my arms up to protect myself, but it was too late. The raven slammed into me with the force of a freight train, knocking the breath out of me and sending me crashing to the floor. I could feel its claws digging into my chest, its beak tearing at my skin, and I knew that this was the end. The Ravenmocker had come for me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. But then, just as suddenly as it had attacked, the raven stopped. It stood over me, its beady eyes fixed on mine, as if it was studying me, deciding whether or not I was worth the effort. And then, with a screech that rattled the windows, it took off, flying back into the flames and disappearing into the fire. I lay there, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I could still feel the pain where its claws had dug into me, and when I looked down, I saw blood, my blood, seeping through my shirt. But I was alive. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Eventually, I managed to pull myself to my feet, my body trembling with the effort. I stumbled into the bathroom, turning on the light and looking at myself in the mirror. I looked like a ghost, my skin pale and clammy, my eyes sunken and bloodshot. I pulled up my shirt, expecting to see deep gashes where the raven had attacked me, but there was nothing, just a few shallow scratches that were already beginning to heal. But the pain was real, the fear was real, and I knew that the Ravenmocker wasn't done with me yet. I spent the next few days in a state of constant fear, jumping at every sound, every shadow that crossed my path. I barely slept, my nights filled with nightmares of the raven, its claws tearing into me, its eyes burning into my soul. I tried to leave the house, to go back to the city, but every time I packed my bags and headed for the door, something would stop me. The wind would pick up, howling through the trees, or the shadows would grow longer, darker, making it impossible to leave. And then, one night, it came back. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it, the sound of wings, beating against the walls of the house. It started as a faint rustling, but soon it grew louder, more frantic, until it sounded like a storm was raging inside the house. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing as I grabbed the first thing I could find, a rusty old axe that had been hanging on the wall for as long as I could remember. I ran to the living room, where the sound was coming from, and there it was, the raven, its wings beating furiously against the walls, its beak snapping at the air. It saw me, and with a screech that could have shattered glass, it lunged at me. I swung the axe, but it passed right through the raven, as if it was nothing more than a shadow. The raven circled around me, its wings brushing against my skin, cold and wet like the touch of death. I swung the axe again, but it was useless, the raven was too fast, too powerful. And then, with a final, desperate lunge, it came at me again, its claws reaching for my heart. I felt a searing pain in my chest, as if my heart was being torn from my body, and I knew that this was the end. But just as the raven's claws dug into my flesh, something strange happened. The air around me seemed to shimmer, and for a brief moment, I could see the Ravenmocker for what it truly was, a twisted, ancient creature, its body a mass of feathers and shadows, its eyes burning with an unholy light. And then, with a scream that echoed through the mountains, the Ravenmocker was gone. The pain in my chest disappeared, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. When I woke, I was lying in the hospital, my body covered in bandages, my chest wrapped tightly in gauze. The doctors told me I had been found unconscious in the woods, my heart barely beating. They told me I was lucky to be alive. They didn't know how I'd managed to get out of the house, let alone survive the ordeal. But I knew. The Ravenmocker had taken what it wanted, a part of my life, a piece of my soul. But it hadn't finished the job. As the days passed, I slowly regained my strength, though the pain in my chest lingered. It was a constant reminder of how close I'd come to death, a dull ache that throbbed in time with my heartbeat. The doctors couldn't explain it, they said there was no physical damage, nothing that should cause the pain I felt. But I knew better. The Ravenmocker had left its mark on me, and I would carry it for the rest of my life. I tried to piece together what had happened, to make sense of the terror that had overtaken me in that old house. But every time I tried to think about it, my mind rebelled, filling with images of the raven, its claws reaching for my heart, its eyes burning into mine. The fear was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to drag me back into the darkness. Eventually, I decided to leave the hospital, against the doctor's advice. I couldn't stand being confined any longer, surrounded by the sterile walls and the constant beeping of machines. I needed to get out, to breathe fresh air, to feel the sun on my skin. The town hadn't changed much during my time in the hospital. It was still the same quiet, sleepy place, nestled in the shadow of the mountains. But to me, it felt different, darker, more menacing. The old legends that had once seemed like harmless stories now felt all too real, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the Ravenmocker was still out there, watching me, waiting for another chance to finish what it had started. I returned to the house one last time, determined to gather my things and leave for good. The thought of stepping foot inside that cursed place again filled me with dread, but I knew I had to face it, if only to prove to myself that I could. The house was just as I'd left it, the door hanging slightly ajar, the windows covered in a fine layer of dust. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest, and immediately felt the oppressive weight of the darkness that clung to the walls. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the shadows sent a jolt of fear through me, but I pushed forward, determined to finish what I'd come to do. As I gathered my belongings, I could feel the presence of the Ravenmocker all around me, a cold, malevolent force that seemed to seep into my very bones. I moved quickly, throwing my things into a bag, my hands trembling with each movement. But as I reached for the last of my belongings, I heard it again, the sound of wings, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. My breath caught in my throat, and I spun around, half expecting to see the raven swooping down at me once more. But there was nothing, just the empty room and the shadows that seemed to stretch longer with each heartbeat. I grabbed my bag and ran, not daring to look back as I fled from the house, the sound of wings echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I sped away, leaving the house, and the Ravenmocker, behind me. But even as I drove away, I knew that I would never truly escape. The Ravenmocker had taken something from me, something I could never get back. And though I had survived, I knew that I was forever changed. The fear that had taken root in my heart would never fully leave, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the edge of the light. The town of Shadow Hollow faded into the distance as I drove, the mountains rising up behind me like sentinels guarding the secrets of the past. The road stretched out before me, winding through the trees and disappearing into the horizon. But no matter how far I drove, I knew that the memory of that night, the terror of the Ravenmocker, would haunt me for the rest of my days. In the end, I had escaped with my life, but the cost had been high. The Ravenmocker had marked me, and though I had survived its grasp, a part of me had been lost forever in the dark hollows of those ancient mountains. And so, as I drove on, away from the house, away from the town, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that somewhere, in the shadows of the trees, the Ravenmocker was still there, waiting, biding its time, ready to return when the moment was right. Because the Ravenmocker never truly leaves. It lingers, in the dark corners of the world, in the forgotten places where the old legends still hold sway. And it waits, patiently, for the next heart to steal. Thank you for watching Serenity Valley Stories. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another scary tale. Share your thoughts in the comments below.